of you here, completely sold out rode hoed. On the other hand, maybe it's not so strange because it's not often that you get the opportunity to discuss and talk with the best-selling author of Russia, who's here in the front row, Mr. Akoenin. So thank you so much for coming. My name is Kisha Hekster, and I will briefly tell you a little bit about tonight's schedule, because of course the main event will be the lecture of Mr. Akoenin in about half an hour on the day today, 100 years ago, the Russian Revolution, Oktyabrskaya Revolutia, and there will be plenty of opportunity for you, the audience, the Russian audience, the Dutch audience, wherever you come from, to talk afterwards with Mr. Akoenin, because this is his explicit wish to talk as much as possible to the readers, if I'm not mistaken. Before that, there will be a brief introduction by Arthur Langeveld. For those of you who have not read all of over 60 books of Mr. Akoenin, there will be a brief introduction about the work and the ideas of Mr. Akoenin. And we will start this evening with a short introduction from Laura Starink, who is one of the organizers of today from Raam op Rusland. Laura, please.
Good evening. It's really amazing that so many people have shown up. We hadn't expected that. I just want to explain very short what Raam op Rusland is about. 3 years ago, at the beginning of March 2014, I was in Crimea, and I saw the little green man with black balaclavas guarding the Ukrainian military bases. 2 weeks later, the annexation of Crimea was a fact. And a couple of weeks later, there started a real war in the Donbass in the east of Ukraine. The West was flabbergasted because nobody had seen it coming, and nobody knew what to do about it. Well, 3 former Moscow correspondents of the Dutch newspapers NRC Handelsblad and de Volkskrant, Hella Rottenberg, Hubert Smeets and me, we had an idea. We said to each other, there is a lack of information. We don't speak the same language anymore. There has to be done something about the fact that academia is silent, journalism is deteriorating. We need to get together and to collect all the available information and to bridge the gap that seems to exist between Russia and the West. So we started to think about organizing a website. We call it a think tank, but of course we didn't have 1 penny, so a think tank was too big a goal. But we started a website collecting information, giving analysis, background, interviews with historians on a wide range of topics to find out what is going on in Russia and why don't we speak each other's language anymore. That was 1.5 years ago. We started the website Raam op Rusland, Aknova CU, window on Russia. Since that time we have published more than 750 articles on very different topics. Well, that maybe is not so surprising because journalists know what a deadline is. But what is more surprising, what was the biggest surprise to us, was that we managed in a short time to get in touch with loads of Russian authors. We were not so sure that we would find people who would be willing to write for our website because, well, as I said, the relations were bad. But we found lots of people who keep telling us it's very good that you started this dialogue. We want to have contacts with the West. We want to be published. We want to take part in the discussion. And so we are very proud that at our website you can find scores of Russian authors. And I must say the last 1.5 years I've learned from them the most. This year we continued our activities by starting some public events. We had one in the Bali in summer. There were 200 people. That was already quite successful in our view. Now we have 450. This is progress. Of course, I understand that you are not here because of us, but because of our distinguished guest, Boris Akoenin. We are delighted to have him here. And we asked him specifically to talk about on the day of the October Revolution with, and have the first October lecture, hopefully the beginning of a beautiful tradition here in the Rode Hoed, which will be held every year. We are, as I said, we are really proud to have you here. You see that you have an audience in Holland, and we are looking forward to your lecture. I will disappear now because it's not my evening, and the only thing I want to say is read us. If you want to know what's going on in Russia, read us, follow the site, subscribe to our to our newsletter, and spread the news. Thank you.
And I already heard one telephone, so this is your last chance to switch it off, because we are going to hear a lot of interesting things. First from Arthur Langeveld, very well-known Slavist and translator. The floor is yours.
Yeah, it seems to work. Can everybody understand my... yeah, this will be a short introduction on Boris Akoenin, a phenomenon, I called it. Grigory Shelvovich Tchartishvili, better known by his pen name, one of his pen names, Boris Akoenin, is Russia's most popular living writer. Born in Georgia, he moved to Moscow at a young age with his parents. He studied history and Japanese there, and then worked as a translator from English and Japanese and as an editor. He started writing novels in the late 90s, preferring to call them belles lettres, amusing entertainment, rather than literary works. In fact, Akoenin is the author of a great variety of works, ranging from scholarly articles about Japanese literature to thrillers. He has sold some 30 million books to date, Harry Potterish numbers, and his works have been translated into over 50 languages. A few appeared in Dutch at the beginning of the century, but he did not find the levels of success in the Netherlands that he enjoyed elsewhere, and no more of his works were published here. Akoenin is most famous for his historical detective novels, set in the late 19th century and featuring Erast van Doorn and Pelageia, a nun. The Van Doorn series is perhaps the best known. The first books in the series were written in the style of various subgenres of the detective novel. A whodunit in the Sherlock Holmes style, such as Azazel, a close detective story set in one location with a limited number of possible perpetrators in the style of Agatha Christie, like Leviathan, and a story which takes us on a tour of Russia, such as The Death of Achilles. Van Doorn, a young nobleman, is a superhero trained in Japanese ninja techniques. He is familiar with all the technical gadgets of his time, and he is acutely observant. These books are real page-turners, full of suspense, excitement, and cliffhangers, as when we leave Van Doorn locked in a dark cellar, unconscious and in chains at the end of a chapter. However, there's often more to these stories than just a thrilling adventure. For example, in The Death of Achilles, Van Doorn is not only confronted with a mighty opponent, but also with a corrupt chief of police, hostile Secret Service agents, a lax opportunistic governor of Moscow, and a military coup attempt. What's more, his mighty opponent is half Chechen and immersed in the gangster underworld of the North Caucasus, where he grew up. In this way, Akoenin incorporates the sore points of present-day Russia in his historical detective novels in an almost playful way. Recently, Akoenin has focused on these sore points more and more. And not long ago, he said he is done with the Van Doren books. In 2013, the first part of an ambitious writing project appeared, a new history of Russia from the rise of the Kiev Empire until the present. 3 parts have been published so far. The first part runs from the founding of the Russian state up to the Mongolian invasion. Part 2 deals with the Mongolian era, and part 3 covers the 15th and 16th centuries, the period after the liberation from the Mongolian or Tatar yoke, the rise of Moscow, and the creation of the Russian state, when the many large and small principalities which made up Russia in the Tatar era were brought under one Muscovite authority. Akoenin is now working on part 4, which covers the 17th century and the reign of Peter the Great. He even makes these more academic works widely appealing. In an interview, he states that he always tries to balance telling detail with a broader picture, avoiding too much dry information and superficial outlines. He has been very successful at this. His books are easy to read and interesting for everyone. Each part of Akoenin's history of Russia consists of 3 books. The richly illustrated historical volumes all come with a separate source book, mostly containing writings by classical Russian historians like Karamzin, Gluchevsky, Solovyov, and Kostomarov. In addition, each part has a book with fictional stories set in the covered period, written by Akoenin himself. Akoenin tries to answer one main question in each part, as he has explained in interviews. The central question in part 1, for example, is how does a new state emerge? And how did the Russian state take shape? Kiev, Russia, seemed to arise from a vacuum. What mechanisms were at play? And why is this state so vital and robust, despite its many defects? How does it manage, after each collapse, to recover again and again, to be resurrected and usually become more powerful than before? Akoenin's views on the country's history have aroused much debate, resistance, and unambiguous animosity in Russia. It was no coincidence that he left his homeland and settled in London shortly after the first part was published in 2014. The political events of that year, the annexation of Crimea and the war in the Donbass, clearly also played a role in his decision to leave. Why is Akoenin's version of Russia's history so controversial? Although the Russian people possess all the characteristics of a herent folk, they prefer to see themselves as victims. Successively, the Mongolians and Tatars, the Lithuanians, the Poles, French, Germans, and Americans, and in all times the Jews, were blamed for Russia's hardships. The Russians like to emphasize the suffering other people inflicted upon them, while ignoring the suffering they themselves inflicted upon others. The major sore point in Russia's history is the Mongolian or Tatar yoke, which is traditionally presented as an extremely dark 250-year period in Russian history. The cruelties of the Tatars are often mentioned to this day. Akoenin believes these atrocities mainly occurred during the first 20 years of this period, when the Tatars were conquering Russia. Western historians have supported this version of events for many years. As soon as the Tatars had vanquished Russia, they withdrew to their Orda on the river Volga and obliged the Russian monarchs to pay annual tributes to them. Russia had become a satellite of the Mongolian Empire, and as long as the monarchs paid, it was left alone. In the centuries that followed, most cruelties, and they were numerous, were committed by the Russians themselves during the many wars between the principalities. The Mongolian yoke existed for as long as it did, in part because the Mongolians could easily provoke conflicts between the Russian principalities. This view of events is not new, but many Russians feel offended by it. Akoenin is quite original in stating that the founder of modern Russia was neither Rurik, Iwan the Terrible, Peter the Great, nor Lenin. He gives this title to Iwan III, grandfather of the infamous Iwan IV, also known as Iwan the Terrible. During his long reign, from 1462 to 1505, Iwan III brutally forged a union from the disparate Russian principalities and introduced the extremely centralized political system that Russia kept ever after. According to Akoenin, he adopted this model from the Tatars, as it was the only example he had of efficiently ruling a huge empire. In an interview, Akoenin says, I quote, "When I was writing the first two parts of my Russian history, it felt like describing a foreign country. But here, in part 3, it was like looking at baby photos of a person I knew very well. This is our state, the same one we still live in. It is only a baby, but we can already recognize the little eyes, nose and ears, as well as some character traits." Later on in the interview, he says, "The Russian state didn't take shape in the 9th century under Rurik and Oleg, but in the 15th century under Iwan III. We still live in the same house. We just put up new wallpaper every now and then, move the furniture around, and threw the concierge out of the window a few times." So, end of quotation. So, this is an uninterrupted history with one common theme, a permanent war between rulers and subjects. From the 15th century onwards, the subjects served the state instead of the state serving its subjects. Subjects do not have any rights, but they can earn privileges if they serve the state and its ruler loyally. The one who possesses power is truly omnipotent, exercising control over all aspects of life, thanks in part to the support of an all-knowing secret police. In recent years, Akoenin has become a commentator on present-day Russia and a scathing critic of Putin. He airs his views during many interviews and in programs, for example, on Echo Moskwy, Russia's only radio station with some claim to being independent. In 2011 and 2012, he is still moderately optimistic about possible positive developments. But this hope disappeared with the annexation of Crimea and the war in eastern Ukraine. Putin has isolated the country, resulting in a period of stagnation, zastoy, similar to Brezhnev's time. Consequently, Russia is now rapidly lagging behind the rest of the world, which, as you may know, is moving in an unknown direction at a tremendously fast pace. Despite his works as a historian and journalist, Akoenin, author of detective novels, is very much alive and kicking. His most recent work, entitled Счастливая Россия, Happy Russia, is a synthesis of a detective novel and his vision of Russia in the past, present, and future. He has managed to integrate 4 essays on this controversial subject seamlessly into one thriller. The book is set in the 20th century rather than the 19th century of his other detective stories. It is 1937, the year Stalin's terror reached a climax. We meet NKVD people, the name for staff members of the secret police at the time, who themselves feared for their lives. The book is tremendously interesting and exciting and deserves to be translated into Dutch and into many other languages. In any case, its author is the master of a range of genres, and we can expect many more great things from him. Thank you.
Your work, your ideas, and your thoughts, and I would invite you to start your lecture, Mr. Akoenin.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. Well, actually, while listening to Arthur, I thought that he said practically everything in a much more concise manner. So I'm going to speak about more or less the same things in a bit of more detail. There is just one thing, just one problem. It's a problem which I always have. I write faster than people read. So Arthur was talking about 3 volumes published, but I have published 5. As you can see. So, and now I will ask you to be patient, because I'm not very good at reading aloud, but I'll do my best. I didn't do it since nursery school, I think. Although I'm going to speak about history, I'm not a historian. I'm a writer, an author of fiction. There is, of course, nothing new in a novelist writing a non-academical history of a country. In 1960s, the American science fiction author Isaac Asimov did that, writing popular history of Egypt, Roman Empire, etc., etc. Now, in Britain, Peter Ackroyd is publishing his multi-volume history of Britain. I think that in modern times, probably only a non-historian can have the audacity or the irresponsibility to produce a comprehensive history of such kind. All professional, all real historians tend to specialize in some field of history, increasingly narrow. What was unusual in my case, I think, was the motivation which compelled me to undertake this megalomaniacal venture. The reason was my frustration at failing to understand my own country. Why is it the way it is? I have witnessed with my own eyes how Russia first got rid of totalitarian regime, and then how it recreated another version of unfree society which seems to be moving towards a new totalitarianism. Similar things have happened before, and more than once. Every attempt to make Russia a freer country inevitably backfired and ended in another, sometimes worse, unfreedom. Every wave of liberalization only led to new oppression. Is there something wrong with us Russians? I started to wonder. All existing explanations did not provide me with a convincing answer. Though I am an amateur in historical studies, I must say that I'm quite a well-read amateur. I majored in history in the university, and most of the novels I have written were historical novels. So I had to do quite a lot of research in different historical epochs. When a writer cannot find an answer to a question that's bothering him, he has to write a book about it. That's what I decided to do. Not with the aim of explaining Russia to my audience, but with the hope of finding answers in the process of writing. And then, if I succeed, sharing them with my readers. I realized that what I needed to do was to waive all my pre-knowledge of Russian history as possibly misleading, and to leave aside all my political views so that they wouldn't prejudice my perception. The method I chose was quite simple. I went to the very beginning, chronologically, and started reading or rereading all available primary sources, chronicles, documents, archaeological data, etc. And only after that, at the next stage, I read interpretations of history written by previous authors. I always knew, of course, that Russian history has been hugely mythologized, and my task was to figure out what was fact and what was distortion of fact or even fiction. In some cases, it was evident, in some not so evident. So sometimes I have to warn the reader. This or that is dubious. This is possible but not certain. This looks like a later embellishment, etc. So I'm in the middle of my work now with 5 volumes written. I'm now in the beginning of the 18th century. This is how my history looks. Inside there are a lot of illustrations and maps. There is no academical paraphernalia. I don't want to frighten off those readers who do not like interest and who are not even interested in it. It is an easy reading, and I want it to be an easy reading. Mine is an intentionally simple-minded history, a very old-fashioned history, in the sense that there was no preset theory or a conception, which I was aiming to prove. No point that I wanted to make. It was a quest for understanding. I was hoping that a theory would generate by itself from the facts, that I would be able to find a yardstick that would allow me to measure evolution and regress. It should be said that this approach is quite against the flow in today's Russia, because the mainstream tendency is quite the opposite. Interpretation of history is a very sensitive issue in Putin's Russia. The political establishment is also very much interested in this field of knowledge. A whole government-sponsored institution, the Russian Historical Society, is preparing the so-called unitary textbook of Russian history. The chairman of this body also happens to be the director of the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation, the Russian analog of the CIA. That's how serious they are about it. The aim of this huge venture is to formulate an officially approved version of Russian history. When it is written, it is probably going to become the only permissible view on history. The right approach to history, in official Russia's view, is to make people proud of their country, to nurture patriotic sentiment, to prove Russia's historical right to contested territories, because those territories had been washed with blood of our ancestors. It's that sort of reasoning. It is, of course, a very emotional, even passionate attitude. It uses again and again the motto of love for our great motherland, and we all know that love cannot be impartial. This makes my attitude towards writing history quite untimely. My history of the Russian state is totally unemotional. I am not proclaiming love for motherland. I am trying to analyze it. I don't feel like a poet or like someone lovesick. I feel like a mechanic trying to figure out how this complicated mechanism works and why it keeps getting broken again and again. In my opinion, an ideal history of a country should resemble a manual, a user's guide, which helps to understand how this machine runs, how to drive it, what can be done with it, and what actions should be avoided at all costs. For understanding history, one needs clarity, impartiality, even a certain coldness. Otherwise, you'll never find what you're looking for. You'd probably want to know if I did find in Russian history what I was looking for, if I have discovered the explanation I had sought. In fact, I did, or at least I think that I did. It didn't happen immediately. It took me 2 or 3 years before, in the volume 3, something like a conception started to glimmer. Later, you will see why. It didn't influence the style of narration. The text remained emotional, strictly fact, no indoctrination, but starting with volume 3, I allow myself to analyze and evaluate the essence of a historical period from my focal point, to measure it with the yardstick that I designed. Of course, readers can agree or disagree with my conclusions. I know that many remain unconvinced, and this is perfectly okay with me. After all, I am not writing a unitary textbook on Russian history. It is enough that this theory works for me. It gives me the answer to the question I had been asking myself. What's the chronic disease of Russian state system? And is there a possibility to treat and cure it? Now, after this long explanation about why and how I have been spending these years, I shall make a short work of the 12th centuries of Russian history. You know that every thick user's manual starts with the section titled Overview. It will be something like this: a general overview of the evolution of Russian state. If measured by my yardstick, the Russian Federation we see today is Russia number 6, the 6th modification of the Russian state. Let me go briefly through the entire pedigree. The first Russian state, which is a very distant relative of the existing Russian Federation, dissipated in 12th century, even before Russia was defeated by Mongols in the 13th century. In the first volume of my history, I describe patiently the events of 9th, 12th centuries, but I had a feeling that I was losing my time. That saga of the Kievan Rus did not explain anything about modern Russia. There was very little connection. None of the actual modern problems could be traced there. All right, I went on to work on the volume 2, dedicating it to the epoch of the Mongolian rule. The remnants of the Russian proto-state, like Arthur already said, was easily conquered in 1230s by the great Mongolian Empire. And for more than 2 centuries, there was no Russian state at all, just a colony of the Golden Horde. Russia became a part of Asia. For me, the study of this period of Chinggis Khan's history and heritage was enlightening, but again useless for my quest, or so I thought then. Soon after, I discovered that those thousands of pages read, recapped, and retold were not in vain. They gave me an important clue when I came to the next period, to my volume 3. In the second half of the 15th century, after a long stretch of non-existence, a new national Russian state was reincarnated. When looking at this Russia number 2, I had a feeling of immediate recognition. This was undoubtedly the direct ascendant of the Russian state I know. So they taught me wrong at school. The Russian state was founded not in 862, but exactly 6 centuries later, in 1462, when the greatest ruler in our national history, Ivan III, ascended to the throne. The previous independent Russia had existed so long ago that other nations' experience had to be relied upon in building a state. Paragon-wise, there really wasn't a lot of choice. Western Europe was a mess, the loose German Empire evidently a state model to be avoided. Byzantium, which had always been Russia's ideal, only recently had been destroyed by Turks. Turkish Empire was yet too young and not well known in Russia. But there was an example which Ivan III knew perfectly well from inside, the Genghis Khanian world order. Of course, it had been seriously corrupted in the decaying Golden Horde, but for Ivan III, it only meant that the great original principles of Genghis Khanian state should be restored. And that is what he accomplished quite effectively during his long rule. Genghis Khan, the builder of the largest known historical realm, where at one moment a quarter of entire world's population lived, built his amazingly effective state system upon 4 cornerstones. What were they? Firstly, the absolute centralization of power. All major decisions could be taken only by the great Khan himself. This highest personalized authority was supported by the pyramid-like hierarchy of executive power. The Mongol Empire was divided into tumens, regions that could mobilize 10,000 warriors. Tumens were divided into thousands, thousands into hundreds, hundreds into tens. This allowed instant mobilization of troops, resources, and working force. The second cornerstone was the absolute sacralization of the ruler, which was, of course, only natural, because such a concentration of power could be justified only by unquestioning idolatry. Thirdly, no law could be higher than the great Khan's will. The horde was obedient not to laws, but to the Khan's decrees, which were issued according to conjuncture. A decree state is more flexible than a law state. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, the Chengizian state looked on its subjects, no matter high or low, as on its servants. An aristocrat or a peasant were equally unfree before the state. Each of them had a compulsory function. This construction, both simple and effective, led Mongols, a small nation, to perform miracles, and Russians of the 15th century wanted to build something similar. All work accomplished by Ivan III and his successors was aimed at reaching this general aim. If you look at Russia as it has been since Ivan III times, you will see that none of the 4 cornerstones has ever been abandoned. And if there were attempts to do so, as we shall see, they would always be short-lived. There were also other features of the Chengizian state, less vital, so that at certain times Russia could briefly live without them, but then they would always re-emerge. The state has to be militarized, not only in the literal sense, meaning a strong army, but also in the sense of subordination. Orders from above shouldn't be questioned. Any administrative authority should be controlled only from above, never by those who are below or independent. Collegiality, consensus are excluded words. Another constant is the absence of individual rights, replaced by a system of individual privileges. The difference, of course, is that individual rights are congenital, and individual privileges can be bestowed and taken at a superior's will. Historically, this stimulus worked quite well. It still does. Next comes the hyper-importance of the secret police, which controls and tends to duplicate all branches of administration. Chengiz Khan invented the so-called keshik, the black two men, 10,000 privileged warriors dressed in black, riding black horses. They served not only as the emperor's bodyguards, but were also used as his untouchable inspectors. In the Second Russian state, Ivan III's grandson, Ivan IV, imitated this technique completely, even to the color of the uniforms and horses. Later, this institution changed its name many times, but it was almost always there, as it is today. The last, but not the least specific feature of a Chingizian state is the existence of a higher goal, which justifies all the misery and unfreedom the populace has to reconcile with. Ivan III was the first to invent it, the idea of the Third Rome that Russia was destined to become. In later modifications of the state, there would be other higher goals. When the Chingizian element would grow stronger, this aspiration would become more passionate. The most recent and the most impressive version of a higher goal, of course, was building the communist paradise. A state structure of this type has its merits and faults. On the good side, it is very sturdy and shock-resistant, which is usually tested at times of foreign invasion or a similar big-scale calamity. On the weak side, a country built in this manner tends to develop slower in social, economical, and technological attitudes because all these spheres demand freedom of private initiative, and a Chingizian-type state is always suspicious of private initiative. If we look at the course of Russian history, starting with the second state, we'll see that the country was quite good at winning wars and conquering territories, but hasn't been really profiting from its victories. It has been constantly catching up economically and technologically with the West. There is one more evident vulnerability. The whole construction is held together only with one bolt, the sanctified figure of the Tsar, of the Khan. If this person happened to be a bad ruler, the structure cracked but held, like it did under the nightmarish Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century. What a Chingizian state cannot survive, though, is the desacralization of the great Khan. The Second Russian state existed for a century and a half, and then the bolt broke. The ancient dynasty ended. A new Tsar had to be elected, Boris Godunov, and he was quite a capable ruler, but he was elected, not given by God. He was not sacral. His mandate and his right to rule was first doubted, then contested, so a civil war called the Smuta, the turmoil, followed, and the Second Russian state collapsed. For several years, Russia did not exist. It was conquered with amazing ease by neighboring Poland. A new version of national state re-emerged in 1613 with the election of new dynasty, the Romanovs. Russia number 3 wasn't there to stay for long. It lasted for 3/4 of the century. The Third Russian state was a hybrid structure. On the one hand, it strived to return to the previous classical Chingizian model with its strength and stability, but the new dynasty was not rooted yet, not sacred enough. So it had to be supported by two traditional institutions, the boyar aristocracy and especially the church, which gained quite a lot of power again in the 17th century. The third state was destined for short life because it was quite a cyclic crossbreed of two different matrices. It still oppressed private initiative, so economy and trade were very slow in development. At the time when Western Europe was beginning to progress at impressive speed, Russia was lagging behind, and the gap was rapidly growing. At the same time, Russia number 3 was not benefiting from the merits of the Chingisian model. It was a loose state with a weak army and inefficient bureaucracy, centralized but unable to control its vast territory, shaken by revolts and coups d'etats, jeopardized by strong neighbors, Sweden in the north, Turkey in the south. By the end of the 17th century, Russian political elite came to the understanding that the state had to be reformed, remodeled, that some sort of Russia number 4 had to be devised. It is a commonplace conviction that Peter I, or Peter the Great as he is known, made Moscovia a part of Europe, that he westernized Russia. But if we measure Peter's reforms with that yardstick of mine, we shall see that something entirely different happened. Peter only repainted the facade to a European pattern. He made his nobility wear European clothes and wigs, but what he actually did, in way of reforming the state, amounted to full reconstruction of the classical Chingisian state. Russia number 4 again became a super-centralized political system with only one center of decision-making, the Tsar, with diminished role of the church and the aristocracy, with militarized bureaucracy, with secret police and all other familiar features. It was a westernization with a strong Mongolian accent, or rather a cardinal Mongolization lacquered with European veneer. Tsar Peter was a bloody tyrant who made his country miserable and his state great, a typically Chingisian paradox. Russia number 4 became a military empire with a strong army and weak economy, a rich state of impoverished and obedient population. It was quite an impressive and tenacious state that existed for 2 centuries, till 1917. At one period, in the first half of the 19th century, Russia number 4 even became a superpower, dictating its will to Western Europe. There were several attempts at liberalization, at changing the Chingisian model to a more modern one, because Russian rulers weren't blind and they saw that their empire was again lagging behind economically. The country, which was not developing fast enough, had to be reformed. But any structural reform resulted in inner turmoil. Every wave of reforms brought on dangerous after effects. The liberalization under Alexander I led to a military coup and to the reactionary rule of Nicholas I. Reforms of Alexander II led to a surge of revolutionary terrorism and a political oppression under Alexander III. The explanation for this vicious circle is quite simple. A state built on super-centralization of power and being held together by one bolt cannot be changed with the help of reforms that weaken this bolt. It only results in vibration and dissolution. Nicholas II, not a bright ruler, repeated this risky experiment in 1905, when the ignominious defeat in war with Japan demonstrated again the need for reform. A sort of limited constitution and a semblance of parliament were established, which, of course, led to revolution, which equally naturally led to reaction and back creeping into the Golden Horde by 1907. The end of the Fourth Russian state was predetermined by the World War, which swept away all old-fashioned military monarchies, each of which Germany, Austria-Hungary, Turkey, and Russia had to live through an ordeal of its own. In February 1917, revolutionary Russia became the freest country in the world. But only a few years later, when, after the end of the Civil War, the Fifth Russian state, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics emerged, it was a Chingizian pyramid all over again, much more so than in the imperial times. The catastrophical chaos bred by the revolution made it necessary to reintroduce and reinforce all the Chingizian elements, even down to the enslavement of peasants. What was Stalin's kolkhoz system if not placing every peasant into state service? Private initiative and enterprise, so foreign to the idea of a Chingizian ideal state, was entirely abolished and even made a criminal offense. The fifth state knew a period of glory in the middle of the 20th century when its impressive mobilizing capacities had a chance to show their worth at the times of the global war crisis. A Chingizian state, a militarized empire, is always at its best at times of war. Joseph Stalin epitomized the spirit, the strategy, and the tactics of Golden Horde. Never since the epoch of Peter the First had Russians been so mercilessly and cruelly drilled. That allowed Russia No. 5 to build military industry in 1930s at an awful cost, starving to death, imprisoning, and executing millions. Then, in 1940s, it secured victory in the World War, which made Russia No. 5 into a superpower for the second time in its history. But when the war was over, when the laws of destruction were replaced by the laws of development, Russia No. 5 began to lose the economical and technological competition like it had happened many times before in its history. And because the tempo of the world's progress was increasing at an amazing step, the fifth state was short-lived. It fell apart only 40 years after its highest peak of greatness. The crisis happened in the same manner as in two previous historical moments when Russia had collapsed. The process began at the top. Mikhail Gorbatsjov did not intend to destroy the system. He wanted only to modernize it. But he let the gin out of the bottle when he loosened the bridle. Freedom of speech, of course, meant that journalists and public intellectuals started to criticize the great Khan, and his authority lost its sacredness, like it had happened in 1605. The newly elected parliament confronted the government, like it had happened in 1905. The secret police lost its formidability because it stopped to fight the opposition. A Chingizian state just cannot survive in such circumstances, and it didn't. In August of 1991, USSR came crumbling down, losing one half of its territory. The new state, sixth by my count, called itself the Russian Federation. Boris Yeltsin and his first liberal government started building a state structure of a principally different nature. But look at what we have today, only half or only a quarter of a century later. Russia No. 6 is ruled by one man whose power is not counterbalanced by a parliamentary opposition, by independent judicial system, or by free press. The Duma is a puppet theater, judges are obedient, all major mass media have become a propaganda machine, the state power is hyper-centralized. Regional governors aren't elected but appointed. Vladimir Putin is the only person who makes decisions. He is effectively a great Khan. As such, he is sacred, he cannot be criticized, only admired and glorified. Any attack at the president is qualified as an assault at stability, which, by the way, is true. The stability of a Chingizian state relies on the sanctity of the great Khan. The third cornerstone is also there. No law is higher than the great Khan's will. In Russia number 6, it means that whenever the Khan needs to bend the constitution to his wishes, the parliament immediately makes the desired changes in the existing laws. The fourth feature, to make everybody the state's servant, is underway. All the contemporary boyars, the oligarchs, have already been either recruited into the Khan's service or exiled. That's what Ivan III did too. At the lower level, the proportion of the population paid by the state and dependent on it has dramatically increased. Middle class in today's Russia, unlike 10 years ago, consists mainly of bureaucrats and not businessmen. We see also the dominance of the black two men, the secret police. There are now at least 4 of them, controlling not only the people but each other as well. So, why doesn't democracy work in Russia? I'm still quite far from modernity in my writing, so there are a lot of gaps to fill in, a lot of details to check, a lot of facts to ponder over. But having got to the 18th century, I think I am ready to give my own explanation of this phenomenon, of a country which changes, but basically stays the same. No one, no reformer from above, no revolution from below, has ever tried to deconstruct the foundation of the state laid down by Ivan III in the 15th century. Russia was designed as a hyper-centralized state ruled from the Khan's yurt. And no matter what the great Khan was called, the Tsar, the Emperor, the General Secretary, the President, this predominant principle of operating this enormous, multi-ethnical, multi-confessional, multicultural subcontinent from one center, manually, has never been seriously revisioned. And when an attempt at decentralization took place, it was always so clumsy and half-baked that grave and alarming repercussions followed. And then, the only way to avoid chaos was to reintroduce the familiar Chingisian system. Boris Yeltsin started in 1991 with all democratic institutions, but only 2 years later, he had to use tanks against his own parliament and to fight a bloody war against separatists in the Caucasus. That's what happens when you try to rebuild a house without changing its foundation. I don't think that Yeltsin's successor, Vladimir Putin, had a cunning, pre-designed plan to strangle democracy. He was just solving urgent issues, and one thing was leading to another. Russia number 6 in 2017 under Putin is very much like Russia 4 in 1917 under Nicholas II, backward, corrupt, and ineffective. Or you might say, like it was under Brezhnev, or under Nicholas I, or under Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich in the 17th century. A renovated and repainted house standing on the same platform and preserving its shape. It is evident that Russia number 6 is not a steady construction, and that in a foreseeable future it will be replaced by a Russia number 7. But even if this new modification is democratic and liberal, after a while the latent mechanism will start to work, pulling the country back to the configuration prescribed by the state's foundation with its eternal cornerstones. New leadership, no matter how revolutionary or how liberal, would face the same dilemma: either turn authoritarian in order to fight chaos, or to go away and leave this work to others. That's what will inevitably happen. That's what will inevitably happen if the Chingisian foundation of Russia stays intact. That's all. Thank you.
I I would like to invite you to sit over here for 10 minutes or so before we give you the opportunity to ask your questions. Very impressive lecture, thank you so much. You even provide me with the water, though I didn't say anything yet. Thank you. You should, yes, I can get it for you. You basically already answered so many of my questions because it was such a large exposure of all these 6 different Russias that are so much alike in your view. The thing that came to my mind was, first of all, you started with that you think that the history books can be sort of like a manual. And it seemed to me that what you wrote so far maybe is the manual that Putin has been reading. Because he's taking into account actually all the things you warn him for.
Well, if he's reading it just to avoid everything that I suggest and do absolutely the opposite thing. Because what he's doing, I think, well, it could work quite well in the 15th century, but in the 21st century, it's not going to work.
But if you look through Iwan III's eyes to this Russia, would he be happy? What do you think, Iwan III, by what he would see? Would he think, oh, well, Putin has still learned all my lessons?
I don't think that Ivan III was like this, actually. Well, I must say that while writing my history of Russia, those volumes, I tried to keep my imagination, well, you know, in an iron fist. But every volume of these is accompanied by a volume of historical fiction. And there, I let my fantasies and my emotions full reign. Like all those, the fictional part of this, it is a history of a Russian family seen through 1,000 years. So if this is the history of political power, that the fictional part is basically about, well, the history of love, history of family, because if there is no love, there is no family. This is how it works. And I wrote a novel about Ivan III, trying to get under his skin to understand his logics, to imagine it. So, and the way I see Ivan III, and nobody can prove that I'm wrong because he's dead
That's
anyway.
Easy, yes.
That he was a very practical man, a real opportunist, and he did what was right at this very moment, always. Always. He was a bit like, you know, Louis XI in France, who lived at exactly the same time and also was uniting his country. It means that Ivan III definitely, I'm absolutely sure of this, would have built a Silicon Valley and would have built an absolutely different Russia and would have staked everything on technology and private initiative and so on. He was that sort of ruler, which Vladimir Putin unfortunately isn't.
Apart from Silicon Valley, I think Putin also tried to build something like that in Moscow, but apart from that, how would he change today's Russia? You mean Skolkovo, the Russians' Silicon Valley? Well, this was exactly something that Peter the First would have done. He would go to Holland, look at this, what to have something absolutely the same, would build houses similar to the Dutch, painted in the same manner, and then there would be serfs working there and dying there in thousands, and there would be police and all that. So it's just the appearance. Russian Skolkovo is not going to work because human thought and initiative goes where it is free, where there are no barriers, where there are no taboos. And you know what's happening in Russia recently in way of reactionary things and prohibitions, and it's coming down actually to comedy. What's happening now with this film about Nicholas II? Oh my God, it would have been unimaginable just 5 years ago. Yes, you're referring to Matilda, the film that was aired yesterday, I believe. But still, there are so many Russians that seem to believe in this system. How do you look upon this?
Because there is this historical memory, because parents and grandparents have always lived like this, depending on the state, serving the state. And besides, as I understand it, the attitude of Russians today, it's not that I don't believe that they support the political regime, but they are very much afraid of a change, because from their experience they know that every radical change makes their life worse, and they would always choose something that is, well, bad but bearable to something that is unknown. And it has always been like this in Russia. Like a couple of months ago, I asked my readers, I have a page on the Facebook which has quite a huge following. I asked my readers, could you please explain to me, why do you support Vladimir Putin? Why do you love him? Just please, those who are against Vladimir Putin write nothing. Just people who support him. And I got like, I don't know, like 2,000 answers. And what surprised me, I was expecting, well, like, you know, this, he made Russia great again, he returned Crimea, the whole of the world is afraid of us and all that imperialist bullshit. There was practically nothing like this. Most of the answers were absolutely reasonable and understandable. And people wrote that, no, we do not like him. We see that this system is corrupt. But if this system is broken, then it will be chaos, it will be poverty, it will be civil war, it will be separatism, and we do not want that. So they are afraid of change, and this will continue as long as life is, well, even half bearable. So the main problem of the Russian opposition today is, I believe, that they cannot make people interested in change, that cannot make an attractive picture of Russia they want to build. They only criticize, they crusade against corruption, they're telling people something that people know very well. They see it every day around them. So there is nothing new in it. This is basically the main problem, I believe.
So you have been writing this history of the Russian state for some years now. Now that you found out what you think now is the mechanism behind it, does it make you more of an optimist or more of a pessimist? I'm always a positivist and an optimist because it's more pleasant to live this way. But on the other hand, I think Arthur mentioned this in his lecture. I don't know if it's true, by the way, but it made you that you had to leave your country, being as positive.
Yes, it is true that I haven't been in Russia since 2014, and I do not intend to go there until things start to change, until I feel that a lot of people now do want change. Until this starts, I'm not going to be there because this is depressive, and well, I wouldn't be able to live under this constant irritation every day. I wouldn't be able to write. And there is nothing I can do about it, because unless people want to change their lives, a lot of people want to change their lives like it happened in 2011, 2012, what can I do? I can write books trying to explain my view of the situation. I can try to make as many people as possible interested in that sort of writing. I can write about my vision of a new Russia. That's what the writer can do, basically.
Yes, you mentioned 2011, 2012. I think I was there when I saw you speak on Balotnaya. Was this, when you look back upon this, was this one of these clumsy ways in which the opposition tried to change the system?
Of course we were clumsy. Of course we were clumsy because we were...
But you were already writing then, yes, on this history. So...
It was just the moment when no, it was exactly this time when I decided to start writing in 2012. Exactly, because I felt that I don't understand this country.
So would you have taken part in this opposition demonstrations if you had already written this book and realized that it might have not changed anything?
Absolutely, absolutely, of course. Because when you feel that, well, how to explain this? Well, someone from just my milieu, with my background, who grew up in the Soviet Union, had always had this feeling of alienation, like you were an insignificant minority, that nobody understood you except several friends, that books that you like to read are not interesting to the majority of the population, that people around you are okay with how they live and you're not. And then this changed. It changed for the first time in 1991, in August. I remember it very well. It was probably the most emotional moment in my life. I remember 19th August 1991, when this coup d'etat happened, and me and my wife, we went to the White House, which was the seat of the democratic Russian Federation government at the times of the Soviet Union. We decided to go there, and we came there, and it was empty. There was nobody there. There were just some tanks standing there and soldiers. We expected to see a crowd, a demonstration, and there was nothing. And we looked at each other and said, okay, let's go back home. Nothing is ever going to happen in this country. And we started going up this, Kalininsky Avenue to the center. And then something started moving towards us. And we saw this enormous avenue completely filled with people. And they were all moving in our direction with Russian flags and shooting something. That was a moment that changed a lot of things for me. And something like that happened in December 2011, because after Vladimir Putin and Medvedev changed their seats and nobody seemed to protest, it was very depressing. And I thought, I'll emigrate. I'm not going to live in this North Korea any longer. And then in December, when this whole thing started in Moscow, out of nowhere, unexpectedly for all of us. Of course, I bought the ticket, and the same day I was in Moscow, just wanted to be there with everybody. And as long as it lasted, I had this feeling that, well, this was my town, that there were a lot of us, that we could change things. It was a very good period. No matter how it ended, I understand quite much better now why it happened. Yeah, I think it will be back.
It will be back, yes? What?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this Russia number 6 is really a very fragile state, and it's not for long. It's too ineffective, and it's 21st century, for God's sake. A state, a country cannot work like this for a long time.
But it must be, it's a very strange paradox that you talked about, that either the state must be very strong and centralized, or it will collapse. So what is this change that can be expected that people will support?
Yeah, this was the crucial question. And in order to answer it, me, being an author, I had to write a book, of course. So I wrote.
We will not settle with this answer.
No. I will explain. This book is published already. I published it earlier this year. It is called Happy Russia. It's a utopia, a very rare genre these days. It is about the beautiful Russia of 23rd century, where everything is right. It's the happiest country in the world. And it is described in detail how this country is organized. Like Artur already mentioned this novel, it is a novel which actually the action takes place at the height of the Great Terror in 1937. And a group of Moscow intellectuals is arrested. They did nothing wrong. They were just sitting, together and making reports to each other about happy Russia, how a happy Russia, what a happy Russia would look like. One of them was a historian, another was a diplomat, the third was a theologist, and so on. So they were just talking to themselves like, Russian intelligentsia loves to do. And of course there was a Stukach, a rat, who got in there, and they all got arrested, and it was just a terrorist counter-revolutionary organization. And my protagonist, this stupid NKVD secret police guy, is sitting sleepily, trying to read this, these reports of theirs. And these reports are inside this novel as parts of them. So he sits there, he yawns, he's bored, and he reads how ideal Russia should look like. And there I describe how ideal Russia should look from my place. And of course, because the main cornerstone of the Chingisian state is the hyper-centralization, the shortest and simplest answer is that you have to start with making Russia a real federation. It should be a federation of, power and money should be divided among the regions of the country in a very clever way, which I won't go into detail there, it would take too long.
You have it all worked out.
Yeah, not me, but my characters. So it has to be something like, United States of Russia, politically.
But this sounds like a nightmare, yes, to the people in power now.
Well, if we are speaking about the present regime, actually there is only one goal and one aim, and this is absolutely evident, the aim of its existence. And although sometimes it may seem to outsiders that they are irrational, or they are crazy, or they are making mistakes, if you look at it from this point, it's all very reasonable, intelligent, and effective. It's just that the aim is different. The aim is to guarantee the lifelong rule of one person. So everything, external politics, internal politics, works only for this aim.
So what needs to be done for this ideal Russia, the Federation of Russia, to come into existence?
Well, of course, this regime has to be changed, but this is not enough. Like I said, if tomorrow we have a new democratic and liberal leader, and if his team doesn't change the foundation of the state, it will be Putin's story all over again in 10 years.
No, this is what I mean. How are Russians going to change these foundations?
Well, let us ask Russians. I'm only a writer. I can just suggest things. What I suggest is turning Russia into a real federation where not everything, where the most vital things would be decided not in the great Hans Yurt in Moscow, but where people live and where they can control the situation and have their saying. Well, just to answer simply, this is the great revolution which never ever happened in Russian history.
And are you such an optimist that you think that you will be a witness of this kind of revolution?
Yeah, that would be fun.
Okay, thank you so much. I know that you really want to talk to the readers, the people here present, so I suggest we start doing that now.
Yes, so
Yes.
please, if you have any questions, ask me, and you don't have to ask me about history or politics. You can ask me.
There's a few rules I'd like to explain, because there's 4 microphones and people, 2 here below, 1 on each balcony. on the lower part, people will walk around with the microphones, so please raise your hand and the people will come towards you. On the balconies, there is 2 microphones that are steady. You can walk to them. They will be pointed out. Please introduce yourself briefly, and if possible, please put your question in English. That would be the easiest, I guess. I already see a lot of people interested in putting the first question. Maybe here in front or there, it's closer by.
Yes, well, Grigory Gishalvich, paradoxical as it might seem, your conception of Russian history as a cyclical repetition of strong state, imperium, interrupted by short periods of smuta, enjoys quite a lot of popularity with the sitting regime. There is this Russian Academy of Sciences working group actually called Imperia I Smuta, that presents Russian history exactly in the same way as a cycle of strong state periods interrupted by short periods of times of troubles, or smuta. So aren't you worried by the fact that this conception, as it were, helps sustain the sitting regime by making it look inevitable? And at the same time, spreading the fear for the Russian revolution, for Russian Bund, не дай Бог видеть русский бунт, кровавый, беспощадный, so that the feeling exists that any attempt to change things is really futile.
What do they suggest? This is the question. Do they see the hyper-centralization of power as the main cause of disease? No, they don't, I believe. And this is crucial. This is the focal point. This is the difference.
Yes, here in the front, please. Could you also please introduce yourself briefly? I will give you...
Thank you very much for that brilliant lecture. It's a very interesting theory. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Vyacheslav Krieger. First, I would like to start with a short remark, returning to what Ms. Laura Starring said on Rama of Rusland. We should not forget that Rama of Rusland was subsidized and by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, so it's and such
remarks are only allowed very short.
Okay,
so
and
please
two questions. The first one: this centralization of the Russian state. Don't you think that it started not under even the third, but maybe a little earlier, when the economic power moved and the central power moved from Kiev to Suzdal and Vladimir? So going from the big cities with the traditions of democracy to some less developed states where the rule of the knyaz was stronger than in comparison with Kiev. This is...
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So we're going here in a bit of historical detail. But in order to answer that, I will have to go a bit into... So the first Russian state, I skipped this part, but this is maybe interesting, important. It was created and it existed because there was this trade route from the Byzantium to the Baltic, which became very important after the Mediterranean routes were, taken by Arabs. So most of the goods were moving in this direction, and there was when a gang of warriors managed to control this route from the north, Novgorod, to the south in Kiev, they became the benefactors of this trade, and they built a very rich, rare, raw and, well, undisciplined, still quite a huge state. But this state collapsed as soon as this trade route lost its importance. Of course, the Arabs were defeated. The Constantinople was taken by the Crusaders in 1204, and there was just no money left, enough to support such a big country, and started to be broken into princedoms. And the Vladimir Suzdal princedom state, it was a failed state. It didn't survive only even, well, half a century. And it dissipated even before the Mongols came. So we cannot take it seriously in the 21st century. It was, I think so.
Thank you very much. Somebody here, yes, please.
My name is Han Emanuel. I have a question to you. In a short period, I have traveled quite a lot in Russia, not only in luxury hotels. I stayed in private apartments and met people at different levels, both in Moscow and St. Petersburg, in Kemerovo and other places. I was there as a social security expert. I came in contact with people high in the departments.
Please also hear short statements
in a healthcare
and
department,
a question.
but also
Yes?
people at a lower level. My question to you is, my feeling is that I'm quite pessimistic about Russia. Mainly because there is a very skew distribution of civilization and knowledge all over the centuries. And it doesn't have changed a lot. And I do not see how it can be changed. The Enlightenment has never touched the masses of the people, and they don't know what democracy is. So,
can it be changed?
Can you? Yeah, that is the question.
Okay.
Well, my belief is
that view.
My belief is that people are very flexible. That they are, if I may say so, like frogs. They take the temperature of the surrounding pond, the pond they live in. When it is cold, they are cold. When it is warm, they are warm. And Russians especially, and I know it from my life experience, can change very quickly. Very quickly. I remember, I lived through 1990s in Russia, and I saw how capitalism was coming out just out of nowhere, how people were learning to provide for their families without any assistance, how middle class, which had never existed in Russia, was emerging quickly and just starting to demand something and to start to become interested in politics. It would have been something absolutely unimaginable in the times when I was, say, a student in 1970s. Where when I heard that kind of talk around me all the time and was saying exactly the same things myself. But then, just look at other republics of the Soviet Union which have become independent. There are different examples. Some of them are look quite awful. Some of them are doing quite well. And it is quite difficult to imagine that, say, Estonia or even Georgia would turn back to submission and to life in a totalitarian state. A new generation has grown up. And even today, young Russians are very much different from what we used to be, and I think they are better than we used to be in their age. So I have a lot of hope for that. But you are absolutely right, I think, in your pessimism if we speak about short-term events in Russia, because I am afraid that this Russian state number 6 is going to end badly.
Yes, there's somebody up there that's already been standing there for quite a while. Please introduce yourself and put a question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Azamat Ismailov. I actually come from Kazakhstan and chose to live here. My question is about Grigory Shailovich. Many thanks for coming and seeing us. My question is about your view on Khodorkovsky's proposal that to dismantle the Genghis Khan model, Russia should follow immediately some sort of a parliamentary democracy. This is something that would be really nice, except that sometimes you compare it with the successful example when the democratic reforms achieved something like in Singapore, but it was more through the autocracy. So do you think this dismantling of Genghis Khan model to the parliamentary democracy is possible? And if you think so, then how it can be done?
Well, I think that if we have a revolution tomorrow and we introduce parliamentary democracy the day after tomorrow, we're going to have fight between the president and the parliament like we did in 1993, because the country is just not ready for that. And talking about Mikhail Khodorkovsky, to whom I talked about this also in detail, and I can see now, I just read it yesterday, that his program now, the first clause in it is federalization of Russia. This is what he thinks now, and I'm very glad about it. And only the second clause there is not introducing parliamentary republic, but gradual move from presidential republic to parliamentary republic, which I believe is probably true.
May I add immediately the second one?
Excuse me?
He wants a second one. You're in charge. He wants to put a second question.
Yes, please.
Go ahead.
Yes.
But then what about the dread of all the imperialists? Suppose the defederalization happens and Tatarstan declares independence. Do you think this will lead to the dismantling of the whole country, or?
No, if we speak about federalization, how I can imagine it, the federalization, there should be several laws which have to be, well, very strictly adhered to. First thing is that there should be something, you might call it a national project or a national idea, which unites all those republics or regions together, which makes it sensible and reasonable and profitable for them to live together rather than live apart. There is something that I propose in this novel of mine, utopian novel of mine, a national project which would hold everybody together. But I won't go into details, it's not important.
Well,
it's just the idea.
I would like to know then, how can such a national idea look like? What would it look like?
So speaking about 23rd century Russia, what they are doing, it's because climate in Russia is so awful. I hate snow and cold. What they're doing there, they are building a huge glass tube from Vladivostok along the southern border to the South European part. It's just a glass tube like 100 kilometers wide, and it's all palms, pineapples, and everything is living there inside. There is a train where we can move to Vladivostok in 2 hours, and there are flowers, and there are theaters, hospitals, stadiums every 20 kilometers. And when you have to go north, there are just branches, thin branches to the north. So this is the national project which holds the whole country together because everyone is interested in it.
Okay, so people from Tatarstan are going to take this.
But, well, returning to the 21st century and answering your question, when we do not have enough money and technology to do this sort of thing, what is important in building a federation which would survive is that every member of this federation should be self-sufficient economically. So there should be no republics which are dependent on the center or which would need donations from other republics, so the country should be restructured this way. So it should make sense. But look at Russia today. It is not really right that, say, some ethnical enclaves like Chechnya and Moscow should live, well, just by the same rules. They want to live differently. Let them live differently. Let them decide themselves how they want to live. And if they want to live together, or if not, they should be, well, I can brag on like this for hours, so I'll stop here.
Okay, there's a lot of questions here as well. Yes.
Hi, my name is Julia, and first of all, thank you very much. I grew up on your books. They really mean a lot to me. And I was keeping this question for a long time already to ask you. I think is one of the solutions how to make the Russia happy is, at least how you present it in your books, is by developing each person as the individual, by rebuilding the whole educational system, building up the initiative of each and every person. But what I see in your books is that each and every time when you have this idea brought up by someone, it always fails. So my question is, have you found the way how it can be implemented in our reality now?
Well, you're absolutely right. I try to describe an absolutely beautiful idea, an idea that seems beautiful to me, and put it into a novel, and then the character who just lives for this idea fails. And why do I do that? Because I want my reader to pick up this banner and to understand why he failed. I will not fail and do something like this. That's how it works. That's why tragical ends in literature works so much better than happy ends. Because when you read a book which ends happily, you close it, you smile, and you go on to drink tea. And when, I don't know, Romeo and Juliet are dead, you close the book and you go on thinking about the situation and what should have been done to avoid this and so on.
Yes, here please.
Well, good afternoon, Mr. Akoenin. My name is Artyom. This guy's name is Kirill. We're both students at Leiden University in The Hague. We study international relations and international studies. Well, first of all, thank you for your lecture very much. That's very interesting to follow. I had a question and Kirill had a question. My question. Well, you basically pointed out eight conditions, eight cornerstones by which Russian rulers ruled Russia. And my question was, what has to happen, if not a revolution, for this to change, for these cornerstones to change?
Like I said, you have to start by changing the first cornerstone, which is actually the column which holds the whole Chingisian order, the hyper-centralization. So, like in Russia today and 500 years ago, if you live, say, in Kazan or in Siberia, and you want to do something to change your life in Siberia or Kazan, you have to write to the great Khan in Moscow, to the Tsar, and ask for his permission, and he will allow it or not. He will give you money or probably not. This is not going to work in a country of Russia's scale. This is not right. So what you have to do first is to pass a huge proportion of power and money from the center to the regions, to the province. You should make Russia a country of provinces. So, well, you know perfectly well that in Russia, if you are born outside Moscow, you have this complex. Because real life is there in Moscow, and if you want to make a career, if you want to make money, if you want to achieve something, you have to go there. This is not the right way. You have to be valuable and needed where you are born. You should have all the possibilities to achieve, to grow where you are born. This is how a country grows, especially a country like Russia. Moscow is like a huge spider or vampire that has been sucking blood and money and talent from this country for centuries.
Yes, please.
Sorry, just to introduce myself, my name is Kirill, originally from Uzbekistan, so I'm quite familiar with Genghis Khan and all of this.
Excuse me, from where?
Uzbekistan, so quite familiar with Genghis Khan and all of the structure. So, considering that Russia is still not fully isolated from the rest of the world, my question will take a bit of a broader scale. What do you think the foreign countries should do, and do you think that what they're doing right now is actually right when it comes to dealing with the, let's say, Putin's regime and the current structure of Russian Federation? Thank you.
I would not hope for any support from the world. I think that all the problems have to be solved by Russians themselves. There is no way out. But I think that other countries should not allow, well, criminal activity by Russian officials. If they are hiding money illegally somewhere, that money should be apprehended and arrested. They can do that much. Because a huge amount of money illegally piped from Russia through different organizations linked to the regime are now lying somewhere, as you know, in offshores and everywhere. This is not right. Something should be done about it.
And which governments are doing that at the moment?
I'm speaking now about Russian government, but though, of course, it's not the only one who is doing it.
No, I mean which governments from abroad are...
Oh, I believe that there should be some sort of accord between United States and European Union, first of all. There should be a law about it.
Thank you. Yes, somewhere in the back. We're getting up soon afterwards. You're not waiting in vain. Yes.
Mr. Akoenin, thank you very much. My name is Leon Dijkman. I live here in Amsterdam. And my question is, I thought the framework that you established was very interesting. And but Russia, of course, is also known for its history and tradition of excellence in literature, classical music, mathematics, etc. And my question is really, is this because of, or maybe in spite of, this strong authoritarian structure?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I've always thought about it, because this unfreedom and oppression, it definitely, gives momentum to a very concentrated, creative force like opposition. And I have, I have noticed it several times. There were authors during the times of my youth who, living in the Soviet Union, made this impression of being enormously talented but not being able to write freely because they live under censorship, and they would emigrate and go abroad, and you would expect masterpieces from them, and then they would produce something absolutely not interesting. And then you would understand that this feeling of tension, of depth, was just because they were inside a cage, and sometimes it is productive for a creative person. But let us not forget that an artist is a very specific creature, and the laws and rules which are applied to an artist shouldn't be applied to a society. What is good for an art? Well, we all know that totalitarian regimes are just wonderful for architecture. Just wonderful. But it doesn't mean that total regimes are good in general. Besides, Russia, I believe, has been benefiting from its unique position between several great cultures: European, Mongolian, Chinese, Central Asian, Caucasian, Slavic. And it has been a blend, a cocktail, a mixture of different influences which gave birth to this phenomenon, which I believe is very interesting and which has a lot of potential. So even without Stalin and Ivan the Terrible, I think that Russian culture and Russian literature would have been interesting.
You haven't become less productive, yeah, moving abroad?
No, definitely not, because living in Europe, I live in a much more disciplined manner than I used to live in Moscow. I do not have to drink every evening with my friends. And besides, there is something, well, disorganizing and generally in Russian atmosphere. When I wake up in London, I feel like Karl Marx writing Das Kapital. I have to go and write.
Good. I promised we go, yes, please, to the balcony, first balcony.
Thank you very much. Hello, Mr. Akoenin. Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. I'll be sure to read your novel, Happy Russia. I'm very interested. My name is Klára Koppenol. My mother is Russian, my father is Dutch. I grew up here quite feeling alienated from the country I was living in, actually, but that's not my question. But just to say that alienation is also possible in a Dutch country. But I was wondering, I totally agree that democracy thrives on decentralization, but we live in a world where centralization and conservatism are more the tendency right now. So how do you see the fate of Russia, maybe the coming 100 years in a larger scale, in a global view? Are we going towards China, and with the high tech combined with this conservatism, what will it bring us?
Well, I wouldn't speak about China because neither of us knows where China is going. Yeah, this is going to be, there are a lot of surprises there for all of us in the near future, I'm afraid. So, well, anything can happen. Anything can happen, and well, there are a lot of things that will happen in Russia, and not only in Russia, because I believe that Western democracy is living through a serious crisis now, evolution crisis these days. We see its effects in just in the countries which traditionally have been the avant-garde of democracy. We see what has happened in Britain with Brexit. We see what happened in the United States with election. It all means that there some very serious changes are happening now, and probably we do not quite grasp and realize what they are about. It seems like that maybe mankind, democracy is overgrowing itself. We have to change the discourse. We have to start to talk differently to people to find, I don't know, another system of reasoning. And it is quite possible that the European Union is in for a big crisis in the near future. So it's not only happening in Russia, it's a global process. And look at what's happening in Turkey.
But I think the question was, in this respect, what does it mean for the future of Russia with this worldwide tendency? Yeah.
Well, what it means in Russia, you mean all these events, or?
Well, can Russia be anti-this tendency, for example, to go its own way?
Oh, I believe that every country goes its own way. So there are no two similar countries in the world. Speaking about Russia, of course, Russia has a lot of differences because it is the crossroads of two entirely different civilizational models, which, well, mostly we were getting the worst from both models, but we can benefit from both of them if we change the tactics. I don't know. I hope for the better. I think that there is hope for Russia, because the most precious thing about Russia, in my view, is that this country has quite a high level of general education, which is important, and it has this potential of multiculturalism, which is also important.
Okay, thank you. There's time for a few more questions. Somewhere in the back. Yes, please.
My name is Alona, and thank you a lot for your talk. I started reading your book when I was 14, and Van Doren was my ideal man for a long time. So my question would be about current situation between Ukraine and Russia. So geographically, Ukraine was part of Russia 1 and was part of 2, all Russia till Russia 5, and right now it's...
And Russia was part of Ukraine, number one?
Yes.
When it was Kiev and Rus.
Actually, I was thinking that I would call it Ukraine 1. Basically, now it's Ukraine 2. And what is your forecast for this sort of like Cold War, not Cold War between Ukrainian and Russian, like Ukraine and Russia itself, like will be solved peacefully? Is it like aim of Putin to make like geographically part to back to Russia 6, Ukraine? Like, what's your opinion about current situation? Thank you.
Maybe there's somebody in Счастлива Россия who already knows the answer to this question.
So the question is how it's going to end or what?
What do you expect?
Well, I don't think it's going to end before, well, as long as this regime exists. And when it doesn't exist, then, well, we'll have to wait and see what's going to happen in Ukraine, because there are a lot of problems there too. But, well, eventually I believe that this crisis, this conflict is absolutely artificial. There was no ground for it. There is no need for it. There will be hard feelings for a long time afterwards. That is evident. And of course, I believe that this annexation of Crimea is an international crime. So I'm not a diplomat. I don't know how it's going to be regulated. But first, there has to be goodwill to solve this problem, which is non-existent
on both sides.
Well, on Russian side,
Russian
mostly,
side.
yeah.
Okay, yeah, 2 more questions. I agree, because first people are already leaving. Yeah, somewhere here.
Hello, thanks for the engaging lecture. My name is Gleb. My question is also about Ukraine, but regardless the relationship with Russia. Do you have some insights or some diagnosis about Ukraine, and what is your advice how to develop it?
It's not for me to give advices to Ukraine, because being a Russian, well, I wouldn't listen to any advices if I was a Ukrainian coming from Russia now. So if there are things that I don't like about what's happening in Ukraine, I'm not going to talk about it.
Okay, last question here. I know that so many of you still have very urgent questions. I think that you are very ready to talk to people afterwards, yeah, to answer some more questions, because it's not possible to put all of them now. So you have the honor of the last question.
Excellent, thank you. My name is Guido de Boer. I'm a history graduate from UCL in London. Though my question is not about history, it's about the future. Alexei Navalny, I believe you know him personally. What do you foresee for him in Russia's future? Do you think he'll be able to bring about the change that you are craving for, so that you can eventually turn back to Russia? Thank you.
So Alexei Navalny is the most prominent figure in Russian opposition who... the problem is that we haven't seen yet the program of Alexei Navalny, of his party. I meant him when I said that the problem of the Russian opposition was that they criticize the regime and criticize, and they have failed so far to produce an attractive program. I know that his team is working on it right now. Actually, I've seen parts of this program, but it's not finished yet.
What is inside? What does it look
like? I cannot tell you. It's just... They're just working on it. They understand this problem, but, well, first I would like to see what they would come up with. I have understood quite well what kind of Russia they want to destroy. Now I want to see what kind of Russia they want to build.
Thank you. I am very sorry, because I know many of you must be very disappointed. Nevertheless, I am very grateful for all your interesting questions, all your remarks. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. The bar will be open, or is already open. Thank you so much for coming, and I want a special thanks for you, Boris Akoenin, for joining us here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. And one question, please, if there is anybody who wants me to sign books, raise their hands, please, because so we'll have to find we'll need a place for that.
Yes, I believe there is a table. Where is it actually? Next to the bar. Table.